ladies and gentlemen, to the final episode of Dean's Talk in this term. I am pleased and honored to welcome my friend and colleague Akiko Ejima from Meiji University in Tokyo at such late an hour, at least when thinking about the time in Japan. It is quite a while after dinner now, and Professor Ejima, who is among the foremost experts in comparative constitutional law in all of Japan, thankfully decided to join us anyway. Welcome, Akiko.
Thank you. It's really great honor to be a part of your great project. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Akiko, many here in Austria or in Europe overall are wondering Japan, or at least parts of Japan, again finds itself in a state of emergency. However, this state of emergency constitutionally doesn't seem warranted, or to rephrase it, the Japanese constitution, I understand it, does not contain an emergency clause. So how does this go together?
Well, first of all, I think we need to distinguish between the sort of classic state of emergency and the specific state of emergency. And yes, it is true that the Japanese constitution does not have a clause to declare state of emergency. And this has been a quite controversial matter because of the past that, before the World War II, the military sort of take the power and started the war and could not end the war. And in the end, the really devastating result for Japan, not only Japan, also for surrounding Asian countries. Therefore, it was no wonder that the Japanese people were careful about to install the state of emergency, which could be misused by the government. But at the same time, the current emergency under the pandemic, then it's not necessary to, for example, close the parliament. The parliament is still running, and also the government is working. So this is not the state of emergency in a classical sense. And the specific law as the special law for the new type of influenza actually does have a clause which gives the power to the government to declare a state of emergency. And the current government using this type of emergency. So first of all, can you sort of distinguish between the state of emergency clause in the classic constitution and the more specific state of emergency for featuring the specific situation with the COVID-19?
Okay, so as I understand it, from what you explained to me, it is a non-constitutional state of emergency, which does not make it an unconstitutional state of emergency.
As long as the current state of emergency is not against the constitution at all, because this state of emergency is very soft, which doesn't punish the people, which doesn't have the penalty, which is more based on the request and persuasion. And it's really up to the shops and restaurants whether they close it or not. Although, because of the current difficult situation, as you know, or you may not know, the Japanese government declared the second state of emergency on 7th of January because of the rapid increasing of the cases. And then they found out that now this is the second time. So people feels that, again. And what is the actually meaning of the state of emergency? What should I do? And as I said already, there is no penalty. Therefore, some people rather not to follow, not to be persuaded by the state of emergency. And so it's more difficult for the government to persuade the people to stay at home. And particularly, there are some cases that the people who are sort of prescribed as positive as COVID-19 and asked to stay at the hospital, but then they somehow left the hospital to buy something and so on. So now some hospitals, or I should say the local government, asked the government to install more powerful measure to make the people stay at home or stay at hospital.
I was quite intrigued when I came across your blog post on Verfassungsblog when you described Japan's soft state of emergency for the first time to a larger audience outside Japan. In Austria, one could argue such a soft state of emergency wouldn't really work, perhaps, or to phrase it differently, we find ourselves now amidst the third lockdown, if you would count it like that, and still it doesn't show the desired effect. Whereas in Japan, the desired effect seems to be achieved by far milder measures. What's your explanation for that? What's your take on that?
This is a very interesting point, and as far as concerned with the first state of emergency, which was declared in April, I think it's a mixture of several elements. First of all, it was a really first time experience, so people didn't know what's going on, and they are probably scared by some reports, particularly one of the very famous comedians. I think he was around 70 years old, but he just passed away because of COVID-19. So which gives the alarm to the general public that, oh, someone can die because of this COVID-19. You know, in Japan, there were still relatively low numbers in comparison to some European countries or the United States. But then someone who has a face, then he died, which creates a kind of very strong message to the people that, oh, this is not just the influenza, this is a really serious disease. And secondly, probably this is the unique aspect of the Japanese society. The rather, well, I don't want to be too stereotyped, but obviously the Japanese people probably make decisions by looking around, observing what others people doing. So if your neighbors following the instruction from the government, then you might follow too, because of not the punishment nor the penalty, but because of you feel obliged because of the part of the society or the community. And particularly this tendency is stronger in the rural area. They're the more tight-knitted community. And I wouldn't think that this is a surveillance society, but the neighbors and most of the neighbors. And then if you heard that his daughter or his son came back from Tokyo and they knew that Tokyo is a more infected area, then they bit annoyed or crossed by the fact that someone came from Tokyo. So they started to gossip, and they might sort of not directly criticize, but that they might started to, say something to other neighbors by saying that, the son of Mr. Barbara came back from Tokyo. So that kind of social pressure might work. And then probably, that's the particularly 2 points I realized under the first state of emergency situation.
Oh, that's very intriguing. Still, the other day, I came across a piece in the Japan Times, and it reported that now second state of emergency, if you will, something was missing that was a rather odd factor in the first. As I learned during the first state of emergency, there was a group of self-proclaimed vigilantes who tried to enforce the recommendations by putting posters on shops asking them to close down, or harassing people on the street who, in their opinion at least, wouldn't abide by the governing regulations and so on and so forth. So this was interesting, this kind of vigilantism, and now it seems to have vanished. Could you perhaps give us an idea how this came about in the first place, and why it's not there any longer?
Wow, you're well informed. And
I tried to do my homework. Yeah? I want to make a good impression when I'm talking to you, of course, Akiko.
thank you. Probably again, the first one is really, it's really the first experience for everybody, but still government did not have any strong measures to make people stay at home. Therefore, some people a bit, I don't know, they might feel that we have to do something because the government did not do anything. And at the same time, you feel that you are right because of the state of emergency. Therefore, you feel that you would dare to say others. Usually, the Japanese people wouldn't take such an action, but in this really special situation, then I wouldn't think that those vigilantes are majority, but they are minority, but they feel that this is right to say something. And also, you might know that the social media, this has a power to motivate some people that yes, I'm right to do so. But at the same time, I felt that in order to make a balance, that there are some people that they don't care to stick with what other people do, such as one of the interesting story is that the government asked the shops and restaurants to close during the state of emergency, and most of the shops and restaurants follow this request. But one of the pachinko parlors, have you seen when you are in Japan? It's a game, and it's so noisy.
I would never admit in front of our audience here that I have actually entered one of them, but of course I have seen them from the outside.
Oh, you did? Good. So it's a kind of entertainment game parlor, and some people love to do, and some people might be, how can I say, addicted to go. So during the state of emergency, most of the pachinko parlors closed, but only a few parlors still kept running pachinko games. And then the government asked to close, but they refused. And then in the end, the government thought that, okay, we can publicize the names of those pachinko parlors as a kind of punishment, or as a kind of, they try to alarm the people that some pachinko parlors are breaking not the law, but the sort of request. But then those addicted people rush to those pachinko parlors which are open, because most of the parlors are closed. So that's a really interesting consequences of the request-based state of emergency. And also this is the limit. Therefore, now the government is considering to reform the law to increase the penalty and punishment, including the imprisonment less than a year, or the sanction as, I forgot how much, but think 50,000 yen or something. But still, it's not deliberated at the parliament yet. So,
but you would say that now that perhaps government measures and regulations are growing teeth, that perhaps this may also be part of the explanation why this kind of self-proclaimed vigilantism is no longer as present as it was during the first state of emergency.
well, first of all, right now, none of the shops nor restaurants are not ordered to close completely. They only ask to close after, I think, 8 o'clock in the evening. So they can still make business. Therefore, probably they don't need to this type of vigilante activities.
Okay. Okay.
But at the same time, interestingly, the Shinjuku in Tokyo, Shinjuku is the sort of center of the entertainment quarter. And of course, they do some very late business and also including eating and drinking and rather more close contact with the people in the shop. Therefore, the policemen and also some public servants of the Tokyo metropolitan government went there and sort of tried to appeal them that you have to close after 8, and also by showing the sort of appearance on the street, and which gives a message to the other people, general public, that what's right and what's not. But at this moment, they don't have the legal measure to impose something. So only message and an appearance, that's all. That's another kind of soft approach to persuade the people.
So it's a soft approach under the soft state of emergency, so to say.
But the coming weeks, this legislative reform will be going to be discussed in the parliament. And one of the main issues would be penalty and imprisonment, because the opposition party argued that it's not necessary to install imprisonment. And also this is backfiring for, how can I say, to get the correct information from the general public, because of the imprisonment, which creates the stigma to the infected people. So instead of going to the hospital or doctors or some health care center to consult the symptom of the person's situation, but if end up with kind of imprisonment, then they don't want to do so. So I don't know. They still too early to tell you the result. But
okay. But
yes,
it's an interesting development now that to see things heading in this direction in any way. However, even if the soft state of emergency, as you described it, is perfectly compatible with the Japanese constitution, in my understanding, the Liberal Democratic Party has tried to introduce a constitutional amendment that would also bring a formal state of emergency clause to the Japanese constitution. Where does this discussion stand at the moment? And are there any lessons to be learned from the current state that may benefit this discussion?
Well, as you might know, the LDP, which is the ruling party of Japan and long-lasting ruling party, and their sort of aim is to amend the constitution. And I think 2012, the LDP published the whole set of proposal of the amendment. And actually, this is not, I think it's more than an amendment, because they change everything in the constitution. So it's really submitting a new set of the constitution, including the amendment of Article 9. Article 9 is about pacifism or prohibition of the possession of any kind of forces. But as you know, Japan does have self-defense forces, which is equivalent of the ordinary armies, which most of the countries do have. And secondly, state of emergency. And thirdly, probably the changing the wording of the human rights in the constitution. They want to add the obligation as well. But then afterwards, they just missed the chance to pursue, to submit this proposal to the parliament. And since then, it's really, how can I say, rather the LDP have not submitted a draft yet to the parliament. So there is no sort of discussion, no national referendum. So there is no experience to try how the people would react to the LDP proposal. I think that's an interesting point because I recently learned that in the context of the United States, the people really, I mean, the parliamentarians submitted a draft of an amendment. So you see what kind of discussions are ongoing. But here in Japan, there is no experience of constitutional amendment at all. And still the LDP might not be that confident enough to submit a proposal because even they might get the 2/3 special majority of both houses, but they might not be that confident to get the simple majority of national referendum as another condition of the constitutional amendment. And I think the last proposal is not a draft yet, but they realized that it may not be plausible to submit the whole set of proposal. So they try to focus on 4 items as the Article 9 and state of emergency clause and electoral reform, and last one I just forgot, but anyway, but then this COVID-19, again, there is no sort of time, no room to pursue the constitutional amendment. Although the former prime minister emphasized that it is necessary to have a discussion of a constitutional amendment. And I think he was determined to propose constitutional amendment during his term. Although he, as you know, they stepped down because of the health conditions last year.
I find it quite fascinating, you know, as a scholar of constitutional law, coming from a country that has a long-standing tradition of a high frequency of constitutional amendments. The Austrian constitution has been amended hundreds of times. Looking at Japan's constitution, it shines even by comparison to other rigid constitutions. I mean, even the U.S. Constitution has been more frequently amended than Japan's constitution, which has so far not been amended at all. The question, of course, I think many of us would have, is the constitution that good? So that you needn't amend it? Akiko?
Sorry,
You're back. Very good.
Voice has stopped. Could you repeat the probably last several sentences? I could not.
Of course. I was wondering what makes Japan's constitution that special, that it hasn't been amended. So not even once. Is it really that good that it has no need for an amendment? What makes it stand out? What can Austrian scholars, what can Austrian constitutionalists learn from Japan's example?
Well, that's an interesting point. And also, sometimes I feel that, oh, it's really difficult to explain in a plausible way, but I try. Well, first of all, I think it's quite helpful to look at the wording of the Japanese constitution, the Constitution of Japan, and it is relatively rather shorter and concise and very general and abstract. Therefore, many things actually can be done without amending the constitution. And you need to separate the sort of content of the Bill of Rights, which is quite general and abstract. Therefore, even you don't, some academics argue that it's not necessary to add specific clauses on right to privacy or right to environment because there is a general clause to cover for new rights such as right to privacy and right to environment or right to blah blah blah. And secondly, when you look at the wording of the constitutional arrangement about the government, so the parliament and cabinet and the court, again, the sentences are quite general. Therefore, you can add actually many things without amending the constitution. So I think that's one of the reasons why Japanese constitution has not been amended, except for Article 9. Article 9 is another issue because it clearly says that Japan cannot possess any kind of forces. Then how can you have the self-defense forces? So we need to separate two types of questions. Article 9, this is very, very political question. And so far, government tried to, instead of amend, but try to interpret Article 9 to stretch the meaning and try to legitimize the self-defense forces and also try to legitimize to have the security treaty between the US and Japan. But then the second group of the question, this arrangement of the government, constitutional institutions, then actually there are many sort of amendment by legislation. For example, the good example is the electoral reform. 1994, Japan changed the electoral constituency system from the sort of middle-sized constituency to mixture of proportional representation and majority system, which is the sort of British model and German model, so mixture. But the Japanese one emphasized on rather majority system rather than proportional representation, which means that this electoral constituency works better for the larger political parties, particularly LDP. So since then, always the power shifts between the LDP and sometimes the opposition party, but most of the time power sits with the LDP. And also this change of the electoral constituency system gives the power to the headquarters of the political party, particularly LDP, and also the leader of the LDP. Formerly, the Liberal Democratic Party consists of several strong factions. Each leader of the faction take care of other younger members of parliament by supporting the election, by offering some electoral money, and which sometimes creates a bit of political scandal because they might get some lukewarm sort of dirty money from the companies, and a bit of scandal. But these are gone, and now the power really centered on the political party. So that's the reason why the current cabinet, particularly probably the Abe cabinet, got the strong power, because he, as a leader of the political party, can sort of take care of others, particularly young ones, by providing money. And at the same time, 1994, they also installed the public subsidy for the political parties. Again, the money centers rather on the ruling party. This is proportional to the seats and votes which each political party got from the election. So as you see, you don't need to change the constitution to change the political arrangement. You just need to change the legislation. So that's so far the reason why the Japanese constitution was not amended. Is it convincing? I'm
No, no,
happy
no.
to challenge.
I was very happy with your answer, and of course, it calls for quite a lot of follow-up. Of course, I would like to ask our audience just the same to interact with our guests. So if you should have any questions at this point or later, ladies and gentlemen, simply use the chat function of our platform here. What you just told me, Akiko, is something that we may have learned as scholars in comparative constitutional law from the American example, that the more rigid a constitution, the more important constitutional interpretation becomes. And evidently, that is something that is also the case in Japan. I was wondering whether or not comparable to the US, where methodology is, of course, the main issue, one may say, in constitutional law discourse, whether you would have similar discussions between, let's say, traditionalists and progressives, and how you would find the position of the current government when it comes to matters of constitutional interpretation. You have already given us a hint that Article 9, and we're going to talk about Article 9, of course, in length at a later point, has undergone a reinterpretation recently that has been abetted by the government. And perhaps you could tell us a bit more about that and how this came along.
Probably I want to point out two things. First of all, who interpret the constitution? And probably that's the difference between the United States and Japan, despite the Japan copy the US model of the judicial review. So this is a difference between Austrian situation. You have the constitutional court, but Japan does not have the constitutional court. So ordinary court interpret the constitutional law. Of course, the Supreme Court, as the highest court, has the last word concerning the interpretation of the constitution. However, this is the important point, the Japanese Supreme Court has been reluctant to play a role of the interpreter of the constitution when the issues are really political and very controversial. And rather, the Japanese the Supreme Court is highly deferential to the legislature by saying that this is a very important political question. Therefore, it has to be discussed in the parliament, which is the representative of the Japanese people. So rather, the Supreme Court try to narrow their territory as the ordinary court to interpret the ordinary law. Therefore, the constitutional questions, particularly political questions, this is not for the Supreme Court. And second point, the current government interpretation of Article 9. I think already the interpretation of Article 9 is so widened by several times. First of all, when I think the predecessor of the self-defense forces was installed, it was because the Korean War. Beforehand, the US Army stationed in Japan, but due to the Korean War, the US Army went to the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, Japan needed to protect to some degree by themselves. Then already the discussion started that this would be against the constitution. So someone brought the case, actually the members of parliament brought the case to the Supreme Court by saying that this special police force is against the constitution, against the Article 9. But as I said already, the Supreme Court refused by saying that there is no concrete case, no victim, no sort of harm of the rights. Therefore, we can't judge the abstract case. We are not the constitutional court. And since then, the Japanese government strengthened this existence to the self-defense forces. So people brought the cases to the Supreme Court, but always the Supreme Court tried to avoid to answer that question directly. But on the other hand, this is an interesting point. The cabinet does have an agency to check the constitutionality of every government bill. And this is called as the Cabinet Legislative Bureau. And this Cabinet Legislative CLB, somehow, how can I say, try to maintain the consistency of the interpretation. So the view of the CLB is that the Japanese constitution, under the Japanese constitution, the collective defense is not, the right of collective defense is not permissible under the constitution. For example, if Japan was attacked by a country, and then we do have self-defense forces, so self-defense forces can attack that country. But what would happen if that country attacked the United States, which is the Japanese allies? But by previous interpretation of the Article 9, the Japanese government could not use the self-defense forces to protect the United States. But the Japanese government wanted to cooperate the United States. Therefore, they tried to, probably first they thought to change the constitution, Article 9. But then the government considered, well, it was difficult. Okay, let's change the interpretation. So they changed the interpretation by using the interesting way. As I said, the Cabinet Legislative Bureau, they kept the interpretation that under the constitution, the Japanese government cannot use the collective defense, right of collective defense, but they changed the interpretation finally by saying that in a very limited cases, Japan can use the right of collective defense. So if the US is going to be attacked, and then this attack might cause some security issues even for Japan, then Japan can use the self-defense forces to protect the US. Sorry, this is a bit complicated explanation, but now the Japan can use self-defense forces for even so very limited cases, but not only for self-defense in a narrow sense, but rather there's self-defense in a larger sense as a collective defense.
But it's a perfect example, actually, for the importance of interpretation when it comes to constitutional clauses. And of course, in the case of Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, that has been in the center of Japan's political discourse for so long, this shines the brighter. This reassessment, or this reinterpretation, if you will, of this essential constitutional clause has, in my understanding, also been due to a quite unprecedented move by the government appointing a diplomat as the head of the agency that you referred to before, and thus breaking with the tradition that the agency would be self-reliant when it comes to picking its head. The government, one may argue, pushed this move by interpretation, and it pushed it quite hard.
Indeed, indeed. This change of the constitutional interpretation by the cabinet decision and supported by the change of the interpretation by this legislative bureau. Actually, it shows that can the constitution stop this way of the changing the interpretation by changing the head of the cabinet legislative bureau, which is actually the power of the cabinet. It's not the direct violation of the constitution, but it is probably violation of the constitutional custom, or at least the internal custom, which was being so far respected by the previous cabinet, but not the previous cabinet, but the cabinet before the Abe cabinet. But then the Abe cabinet is smart enough, or not sort of, he didn't care to change the custom at all, and just promoted the head of the legislative bureau to the justice of the Supreme Court, and then he bring in the diplomat whose view is shared by the Prime Minister Abe. And so this was really interesting, probably controversial case. But again, as I said, this is a more sort of how can you protect, how can you prevent such things happen by the constitution? And probably it's really difficult. Rather, this should be dealt by the election or the politics. So by seeing what's going on by the general public, and then how the general public react to those cases, or this particular case. But as you know, the LDP won the election afterwards. So we have to see that the general public supported the LDP, although not because of this security policy, but because of probably the stability. This is another probably interesting point to compare the mentality of the general public in general, although of course there are some minorities, but as a majority, people prefer to keep the stability, even they have sort of some complaints or minor concerns, but as long as business goes on, then they support the bigger one, I should say. And probably another current difficult aspect of the Japanese politics is there is no stable, strong opposition parties. Since the Democratic Party of Japan lost the power, then there is no strong opposition party at all. So rather, inside the LDP, always the fight against the factions creates the balance in the LDP. But again, this structure of the balance between factors were somehow weakened by the change of the constitutional constituency, as I said already.
I find this all quite intriguing. One may say, in an Acromanian perspective, that of course the population, or at least the voters, they supported the move by the government, and perhaps now this reinterpretation and the bold move that preceded it are entrenched by popular consent after the voters decided to actively support this move, or at least man would argue in a similar manner if it was the US Constitution. And perhaps this particularly applies, pardon me, just one half sentence to follow up on that, in another rigid constitution such as the Japanese constitution, yeah, when reinterpretation is actually the thing that matters most when it comes to what the constitution, what the law says. It's not so much about formally changing the law of the land. It is about the governing understanding of the law of the land as understood by the governing elites. And these governing elites, evidently and broadly, have been supported in their understanding by the sovereign. I mean, that's something.
Well, they probably, I can refer to some public poll, and interestingly, the Japanese government appreciate Article 9, and also they consider that Japan is a pacifist state. And at the same time, when they ask about the necessity to amend the constitution, then the percentage of the people which says, yes, it is necessary to amend or it's necessary to consider, is growing. And particularly, probably the situation has been changed since after World War II. So after World War II, first of all, Japan was such a weak country after World War II. Everything was destroyed, and of course, and also there was no sort of room to help other countries. So, such as how can you contribute in peacekeeping operation? There was no such a question after World War II immediately. But then in the 90s, Japan became more sort of economically developed countries. And then the international community see Japan as a rather stable country and which can contribute in peacekeeping. And then what how can I say, what does Japan can do is an interesting question. And so far, because of Article 9, first of all, Japan could not send the self-defense forces to the UN keeping operations or some kind of military activities by allies. No way out because of Article 9. But then the government and rather sort of one group of academics would say that now it is time to reconsider the role of Japan. But at the same time, Japan is not situated in the West, but in Asia. Then how the other Asian countries would see the choice done by the Japanese government. So still, it's a quite mixed situation, but definitely it is really time to think in a more, how can I say, objective way, that what kind of role Japan can provide in Asia particularly, and also in the international community. And probably Article 9 is still very controversial issue, and because it's so controversial, the probably general public would avoid to think and discuss. Only heated right wing and left wing always they discuss in a very heated way, but which again creates the situation that the general public, oh, we can't discuss. So I think it is really, first of all, it's necessary to create the environment where the people can have more calm discussion, more discussion based on facts and evidence rather than political heated argument, which has been repeated so often.
Okay, I understand. What I'm curious about now is a thing that you mentioned earlier. Perhaps one could argue that the strength or the power of the government's interpretation of the Constitution also, and in particular when it comes to public discourse, is derived, at least partly, but this may be the major part, from the rather passive stand the Supreme Court takes on issues of interpretation. You already indicated that before. The Supreme Court, by the Constitution, has expressly and explicitly the power to engage in judicial review. However, it is very reluctant to do so. It has done so, if my understanding is correct, overall only 10 times. The first time in 1973, so that was nearly 30 years after Japan's constitution went into force, and seeing the report on the Austrian Constitutional Court and how many laws are regularly struck down by the Austrian Constitutional Court in a year, that easily surpasses this number. How do you explain this reluctance to actually engage in this essential function of an apex court, according to the rule of law?
Well, how can I answer this question? Probably 2 points. First point is for the Supreme Court, this is the new function. Therefore, there is a really variety of choices that what kind of judicial review could be. But the Supreme Court rather chose the sort of safest choice, and also probably the Supreme Court is the ordinary court, and they just follow the tradition and their way of functioning formally, because there is no sort of reason to change themselves completely because of this Article 81, which clearly says that the court can decide the constitutionality question. And secondly, the who would choose the justices of the Supreme Court? Then the cabinet actually does have a power to choose, although the custom is the Supreme Court submit the list or they submit the names, and then the cabinet nominate according to the request. But after all, by taking into account that the Japanese politics since 1955, the LDP has been the only ruling party with just a minor few exceptions. So the political, not only the political setting, but also the judicial branch itself is, in a way, how can I say, in a way, it's how can I explain this? The sort of the I wouldn't say that the Japanese justices feel political pressure or something, but in the long run, so everything is somehow under the influence of the system which is created by the long-lasting ruling party.
Mhm. Perhaps the whole political system is entrenched and not
So,
simply some ways of
there is
interpretation.
no sort of constant shift of the political changes of the political powers. If you do have the constant change of the political powers, then when you see the US, the Supreme Court, then justices are really politically nominated. But because the president changes, as we just witnessed, so conservative justices and liberal justices, and it's a quite mixed. But in the case of Japan, the justices are nominated by the cabinet, which is mostly the LDP cabinet. Therefore, the it cannot be that liberal. It cannot be that conservative. The government is wise enough not to push too far. But in a way, it's a really contrasting example against the US model, despite the quite many parts of the Japanese constitution modeled on the United States, particularly the judicial review.
Mm. Well, it seems that what we have here is a more or less natural political symbiosis, if you will, between government and judiciary, or executive and judiciary, simply because of the great degree of political stability and continuity, at least when it comes to the ruling party. As you already described, within that party, several wings have in the past, prior to the Abe cabinet, torn in various directions, you may say. And some are arguing, of course, that now under Abe's successor, these times may come back when the party is, let's say, a bit more torn than it was over the last couple of years, that provided for so much institutional and also personal stability.
Mm, mm. I think uh, probably the LDP, why it can last so long, because it's quite flexible and it has a sort of probably a good mechanism to make a balance between several strong factions. So when you swing this way and then the other way, but during the Abe period, this swing so far did not work much. But then after Abe, we can observe what would happen, because yes. And also probably I can mention the other issue, particular gender issue. Do you know the gender gap index in Japan surprisingly very low, as they among about 151 or 150 countries, Japan was ranked as 121. So
Well,
again,
that's not really impressive, is it?
it's quite a surprise. And by seeing that there is no discrimination between men and women at education, and now the parents support daughters to go to university and pursue their academic career. But then afterwards, when you join the companies, suddenly there is a gap. And interestingly, every field as the political branch, public sectors, and local government, women were so low represented, surprisingly. So it might shows again that the instead of breaking the ceiling, the Japanese tendency try to respect the tradition and custom and harmony and so on. Therefore, it is extremely difficult to change drastically. So it takes more time, but sometimes it's good because sometimes the radical movement rather creates the disturbance and many victims. But in other cases, particularly gender equality, they yes, it's a bit of surprise, but might be the another reflection of the nature of the Japanese society.
Or at least some long roads still ahead. If you allow for one last question, Onsberger has just asked in the chat, because I find it very interesting. She would say, if I get the point correctly, that traditionally human rights, and as you're an expert in human rights, you may have an easy time answering that question, have been used as a vehicle for progressive forces in the institutions to work against the entrenchment of structures, if you will, in various respects. Does this not apply to Japan?
Well, thank you, Anna, for wonderful question. I would say, of course, some court cases can break the barrier, and at the same time, when the LDP is convinced that it is right to do, then it's so quick to have legislation. So the Christoph mentioned that there were only 10 cases where the statutes were struck down, and among them, probably half of them are rather related to the old law, such as the legislated even before the World War II. So it was so old. Therefore, the Supreme Court feel relaxed to admit that this is against the Constitution. But more difficult issues, particularly related to gender issues. Recently, there are interesting two court judgments, 2015, which is all about the civil law. One is about, one article says that the women who divorced and then need to wait 6 months to remarry. Do you understand the sort of reasoning of this legislation? It's because the law says we need to protect children. If the mother, if a woman married immediately, then a child in her womb might not be clear who is the father. But this is really about the old situation where you don't know whose father is. But now you can have the DNA testing. It's so easy to find out whether the woman is pregnant or not. And at the same time, the marriage age gets higher and higher. And also elder women might marry and then she may not be pregnant at all. So this is really discriminatory. And the Supreme Court says this is against the Constitution. It's too long to wait for 6 months. So 100 days is enough. So it's still not liberal enough, but the courts made a decision. But on the other hand, there is another article which says a man and a wife, when they marry, has to choose either husband's name or wife's name as a surname as a couple. And you have to write down which name you're going to choose for the application form. So if you don't choose, then your form would not be accepted by the local government, so you can't marry. But you know, nowadays women keeps the job. She wants to keep the name, and also due to the sort of more and more people have a smaller family. So if you stick with only husband name can be the couple's name, then this is not the convenient for the modern life. So one of the women brought the case to the court. But then the court says, well, this is the question has to be discussed in the parliament, as I said already. So the court refused to say this is unconstitutional in 2015. But then another case came up to the court. Now 3 cases came to the Supreme Court. And at the same time, the public poll says that the majority of the people accept that we can have an exceptional case, I mean, the additional system to the present system, installing the women and husband can just keep the maiden's name both. So the Supreme Court now sent this case to the Grand Chamber to re-examine the constitutionality. So probably for you, still, it takes more time. But in a Japanese standard, whoa, in 5 years, the Supreme Court might change the view. So I try to be hopeful to see the new tendency would occur even in the Japanese society. So to make it short, then yes, there are many progressive forces. First of all, the people, the victims, who want to bring the case to the court, and some lawyers support them. And then there are human rights NGOs, and then the parliamentarians who are convinced by the necessity to change the law. So it takes more time in comparison to other countries, other developed countries, but it's not necessarily the really, what do you say, sleeping country.
I see. Well, progress sometimes takes time. Um, uh, final question, if you allow, that may be the most important of all, and you can really give it a quick answer, but I think all the members of our audience will be excited to learn about your view on that. Will we have Olympic Summer Games this year in Tokyo?
Ah, no one can answer this question right now. The government says they will hold the Olympic game, but according to the public poll, the majority would say, yeah, rather reacted negative, unfortunately.
So for
But
once, there is, it seems, a disparity between the view of the government and the view of the people when it comes to that.
well, I think government cannot say at this moment that we would cancel the Olympic game. This is because of the business interest, and also probably they they spend already a lot of money, and if they cancel, they lose a lot of money. So they still try to stick with the original idea, but at some point, in March, actually 24th March, I think the government announced that they are going to postpone the Olympic last year. Yes, and then the next day, the Tokyo Metropolitan Governor pushed the government to asking to declare the state of emergency. So even the Olympic is quite political question and related to this COVID-19. So I would say nobody can foresee what's going on.
In any case, let's keep our fingers crossed. Thank you so much, Akiko, for being with us tonight and for spending so much time with us answering all these questions so diligently. Thank you, of course, all ladies and gentlemen in the audience for being with us this afternoon and being an active part of our discussion. Dean's Talk will be back in the next term. I think the break that we take now is well deserved for all of us. It will be back in some other shape or form that shall be announced once it has been properly discussed. And I hope to welcome as many of you as possible back here, either on site or virtually. For now, Akiko, once again, many thanks. This has been great, and best wishes to Tokyo.
Thank you very much. It was really great honor and great pleasure to talk with you, and best of luck for everybody. Stay safe and healthy, and we will meet soon in person. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good night, and
Bye.
have a good afternoon.